I remember the moment I decided to leave. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt calm. That should have scared me. There was no argument, no breakdown, no final straw. Just a quiet clarity that settled in my chest like a verdict. I told myself I had stayed long enough, endured enough, tried enough. Leaving felt logical. Necessary. Clean. I believed that distance would fix what reflection never had. That if I removed myself from the environment, the weight would lift. That I would finally breathe without effort. So I left. I packed lightly, emotionally and physically. I didn't want to carry too much with me, not objects, not memories, not questions. I framed the departure as a reset, a new beginning, a courageous act. People said I was brave. I believed them. At first, leaving worked exactly as promised. The pressure eased. The constant friction disappeared. No one expected anything from me. No one knew my history. No one reminded me of who I had been. I mistook that anonymity for freedom. I told myself I was starting over. But what I was really doing was starting away. Away from unresolved decisions. Away from relationships I didn't know how to repair. Away from a version of myself I didn't understand anymore. I didn't notice that I had brought something with me. Me. The first cracks appeared slowly. Not as panic or regret, but as a faint sense of repetition. New places, new routines, new faces, but familiar patterns underneath. I avoided the same conversations. I reacted to the same triggers. I made the same emotional adjustments. I blamed the transition. Moving is hard. Change takes time. Healing isn't linear. Those explanations sounded reasonable. They delayed the truth. I realized I had expected leaving to be transformative on its own, as if geography could do the work that introspection hadn't. As if distance automatically created clarity. It doesn't. Distance only reveals what you refuse to look at up close. I began to notice how often I described my past in vague terms. How carefully I avoided specifics. How I framed my departure as inevitable, necessary, justified. That narrative protected me. Because if leaving was the solution, then staying had been the problem. And if staying was the problem, then I didn't have to ask what part one played in it. I had escaped the context, not the conflict. There were moments when the silence became too loud. Nights when I felt a strange hollowness instead of relief. Times when the absence of pressure didn't feel peaceful, just empty. I told myself that emptiness was part of the process. That I needed time to fill it with something new. But emptiness isn't a neutral space. It reflects you back to yourself. And what I saw wasn't clarity. It was avoidance with better scenery. I started to understand that I hadn't left to find myself. I had left to stop confronting myself. The realization didn't come as a sudden breakdown. It came as a quiet, unsettling recognition during an ordinary moment. I was doing something simple, routine, familiar, and I realized I felt exactly the same as I had before leaving. Different surroundings. Same inner distance. That's when the question I had outrun finally caught up with me. If leaving didn't change this, what exactly was I running from? And worse, what if the thing I was trying to escape wasn't a place, a situation, or a life, but a version of myself I refused to face? That thought sat with me heavily. Because it meant that leaving hadn't been a solution. It had been a pause. And pauses don't resolve anything. They only delay the moment when you have to look inward and admit that some exits don't lead forward, they just move the problem somewhere quieter. I had believed that leaving would save me. I was wrong. It only made the truth harder to ignore once the novelty of leaving wore off, silence moved in. Not peaceful silence, exposed silence. The kind that doesn't distract you, doesn't soothe you, doesn't let you pretend. The kind that asks questions without words and waits patiently for answers you don't have. I had thought that distance would soften everything. That space would blur the sharp edges of memory and give me room to rebuild. Instead, space acted like a mirror. Without familiar noise, I could hear myself more clearly. And what I heard was unfinished. I noticed how quickly I recreated old habits in a new place. How I structured my days the same way. How I avoided the same emotional risks. How I told the same stories about myself, just to different people. I had changed my surroundings, not my patterns. That realization was uncomfortable because it stripped away my main justification. If the problem followed me, then it wasn't something external I could outrun. It was internal, embedded, practiced. I began to see how carefully I had framed my leaving. I told myself I was choosing freedom. I told others I needed space. I told everyone that this was about growth. What I didn't say, even to myself, was that I was exhausted by accountability. That I didn't want to face the consequences of staying. That I didn't know how to repair what I had damaged or admit what I had avoided. Leaving had given me a clean narrative. Starting over always does. People don't ask hard questions when you're beginning a new chapter. They assume courage. They admire decisiveness. They don't dig into what came before. I leaned on that. But alone, without an audience, the story unraveled. I started to feel a strange guilt, not the kind that comes from doing something wrong, but the kind that comes from unfinished responsibility. A sense that I had exited a conversation mid-sentence and convinced myself it was complete. I thought about the people I left behind. Not with nostalgia, but with unease. I realized how many things I hadn't said. How many explanations I had skipped in favor of simplicity. How many truths I had left unspoken because they were inconvenient. I had chosen distance over honesty. At the time, it felt merciful. Cleaner. Less painful. But distance doesn't resolve emotional debt. It compounds it. I noticed how often I avoided forming deep connections in my new life. How careful I was to keep things light, manageable, temporary. I told myself I was being cautious. In reality, I was afraid of repetition. I was afraid that if I got close to anyone, the same dynamics would emerge. That the same fractures would appear. That I would have to confront the same questions, and admit that leaving hadn't fixed anything. So I kept people at arm's length. That loneliness was different from the loneliness I had felt before leaving. Before, I felt confined. Now, I felt unanchored. There was no friction, but there was also no grip. I realized then that escape removes resistance, not direction. Without resistance, you drift. I drifted for a while. Days passed without shape. Decisions felt arbitrary. I could do almost anything, and that freedom felt strangely heavy. When everything is possible, nothing feels necessary. I had wanted that. I had dreamed of that. But necessity gives life weight. Without it, my days felt thin. That's when I finally allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided since the moment I left: what was I hoping would happen? Not in vague terms like healing, or clarity, or a fresh start. Specifically, what did I think leaving would solve? The answer was uncomfortable. I had hoped leaving would absolve me. Of guilt. Of responsibility. Of the need to explain myself, to others and to myself. I had hoped that distance would erase the parts of me I didn't want to face. It didn't. It just removed the distractions. I began to understand that escape is seductive because it feels like action. Movement creates the illusion of progress. Packing, leaving, changing environments, these things look decisive. But real change doesn't begin with motion. It begins with confrontation. And I had skipped that part. I didn't leave because I was done. I left because I didn't know how to stay honestly. That realization shifted everything. It meant that returning wasn't the answer, but neither was running further. I had already learned that no amount of distance would create resolution. The work I avoided was portable. It traveled with me. I began to see that my departure had been a way to preserve an image of myself, as someone who takes action, who doesn't get stuck, who knows when to walk away. That image mattered to me more than I admitted. But images don't sustain you when no one is watching. Alone, I had to sit with the truth that I had mistaken escape for growth. That truth didn't accuse me. It invited me. Invited me to stop running. To stop narrating. To stop justifying. To finally ask, if I'm not running anymore, what am I willing to face? That question didn't come with answers. But it marked the end of my escape. stopping didn't feel heroic. There was no dramatic turning point, no speech to myself, no clear moment where everything finally made sense. I simply reached a place where running no longer worked. Not because I had nowhere left to go, but because I was tired of carrying the same weight into new rooms. I didn't go back. And I didn't keep moving forward the way I had planned. I stayed where I was and did something I had avoided my entire life. I looked inward without trying to fix anything. That was the hardest part. I didn't analyze my past to justify it. I didn't reframe it as necessary or meant to be. I didn't turn it into a lesson right away. I let it exist as it was, unresolved, imperfect, unfinished. I allowed myself to admit something I had never said out loud. I left because I was afraid to face who I was becoming. Not afraid of others. Afraid of myself. Afraid that if I stayed and looked honestly, I would have to take responsibility, not just for what had been done to me, but for what I had avoided, enabled, postponed, and silenced. Leaving had given me plausible deniability. Staying with myself removed it. I began noticing how often I tried to narrate my life instead of experiencing it. How quickly I reached for explanations when something felt uncomfortable. How instinctively I wanted to label my leaving as growth so I wouldn't have to examine its cost. I stopped doing that. Not immediately. Not perfectly. But consistently. I learned to sit with discomfort without translating it into movement. To let regret exist without turning it into self-punishment. To acknowledge responsibility without collapsing under it. Something unexpected happened then. The shame softened. Not because I excused myself, but because I finally understood myself. I saw how overwhelmed I had been. How little space I had felt I had to be uncertain, flawed, or honest. How leaving had felt like the only way to survive without breaking completely. I stopped judging that version of me. Judgment had never helped. I also stopped romanticizing escape. I saw it clearly now, not as failure, not as betrayal, but as an incomplete solution. A chapter that had given me distance, but not direction. The real work began when I stopped asking, where should I go next? And started asking, how do I want to live, wherever I am? That question didn't demand a move. It demanded presence. I began making smaller choices differently. Not big declarations, subtle shifts. I spoke more honestly. I allowed conversations to be uncomfortable. I stayed in moments that triggered my old urge to disappear. Sometimes I failed. Sometimes I retreated. But I noticed it now. I named it. I returned. That alone changed everything. I realized that escape had been my way of controlling pain, by avoiding it altogether. Presence offered no such control. It required me to feel disappointment, regret, uncertainty, and hope without guarantees. But it also allowed something else. Connection. Not just with others, with myself. For the first time, I could feel my own reactions without immediately judging them. I could want something without rushing to abandon it. I could admit confusion without turning it into action. I wasn't cured. I was available. I stopped believing that leaving was the same as choosing. Leaving is motion. Choosing is commitment to reality, not fantasy. I had left my life thinking distance would save me. What saved me was staying, not in a place, but in myself. If you're listening to this and you're dreaming of leaving, not because you know where you're going, but because you need the pain to stop, I want you to hear this gently. Leaving can give you space. But space doesn't give you answers. If you don't face yourself, you'll meet the same questions in quieter rooms. I don't regret leaving. It showed me something essential. It showed me that there is no escape route from yourself, only longer paths back. I didn't go back to who I was before. I didn't become someone new. I became someone honest enough to stay present. And that presence, flawed, unfinished, uncomfortable, has been more healing than any distance I ever put between myself and my life. I thought leaving would save me. It didn't. But stopping did. And that's how, long after the escape, I finally began to live, not by running towards something else, but by no longer running from myself.